We are going to be in Mark chapter 7, continuing our series and focusing in on what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. As we've said, Mark has two main emphases. One's showing us clearly who Jesus is, so that we know. Mark was like, a lot of stories were out there about who Jesus was. A lot of people had ideas about who he was. Was he a failed Messiah? Was he just a miracle worker? Was he just a good teacher? Who was he? And same kind of questions that happen today, right? A lot of people ask, like, who is Jesus really? And Mark was like, I know who he was. And so I'm going to tell you. And so he set an account down for us using different sources, probably specifically Peter, the apostle. It mostly is from his perspective, but it's probably from some other perspectives as well. And he shows us clearly who Jesus is. But then he also shows us that because of who Jesus is, that we can't just be neutral. We can't just say, like, yeah, Jesus is a cool guy. Like, we've got Jesus' baseball card or something, right? Like, we've got a painting of Jesus, and that's cool. And, sometimes we talk about him, but no, like, what does that mean for your life? If he really isn't just a miracle worker, if he really isn't just a teacher, if he really is God, as Mark clearly portrays him as, if he's divine, and he says very important and specific things, does very important and specific things, showing us how to live, then what does that mean for us and our life? Like, how should that inspire our lives and how we live according to who he is? So here we're going to see a couple of stories in chapter 7, starting in verse 24, and we're going to read all the way to verse 37. There are two stories kind of tagged on one another. But before we do that, we're in football, kind of the end of football season. So it's getting pretty amazing. The games have so much weight now, right? Because if you get eliminated, you're out of the championship, and you can't move on. And, of course, the great goal is the Super Bowl. And as these teams play one another, you've seen also, as some of them have dropped off, the teams that are like not going to the Super Bowl and are already out in the running, they have these questions about, like, what are we going to do with our team? Do we continue trying to do the same thing that we were doing before, or should we change it up? And who does that often end up focusing on? The head coach, right? Like, there's always a question of, what a job, right? It's a good thing these guys are paid well, because it's like, you might be in that job for 2 to 3 years. Like, that's, you can turn this thing around in 2 to 3 years and we'll keep you. Otherwise, we'll be looking for somebody else. So job security as an NFL head coach is probably not super high, generally speaking. But when you are looking at your team and you're saying, okay, we need to change things. We've been a losing team for the last, however many years. And we need to change that. We've got good players, we've got a good budget, we've got all these things, we've got a good fan base, but how can we change things up? And generally speaking, the head coach is, the one that they focus on. And the reason why is because the head coach doesn't come in and just talk strategy. The head coach is not somebody who just comes in and says, okay, I have some secret plays that I've always used, and of course when I use them, they're no longer secret, so I don't know how it works. But I have I got this mojo, and I'm going to bring it to your team. Usually, what they're looking for is a change of culture, change of values. Because in order for a team to really turn itself around, something deep has to change. The values of the team have to change. And so a lot of times, this is what happens. They'll hire a coach, and the coach has to come in and instill new values. Like before there wasn't any transparency between coaches and team. It was more of this hierarchical thing where you just did what you were told, and that communication didn't happen. That was the culture. And if you did communicate something, if you did push back on something, you were lambasted and blackballed, right? Well, we're going to change that. Now we need to hear from you, right? That's a culture change. And a coach that does that can turn things around for a team. And in the book of Mark, we see this shift for Jesus. He has been focusing his ministry, as he said, and we'll look into this a little bit later, as it was God's plan. He's been focusing his ministry on the Jews because he was their Messiah. He's been focusing on the Jews, the children of Israel. But there is this obvious shift in the book of Mark now to the Gentiles, those who didn't believe in God as the one true God, those who weren't a part of the covenant of God with Israel, those who were outsiders to the covenant. He obviously makes a shift here. He is making a culture change. He's like the new coach that's coming in. He's saying, okay, you used to have some values, and we've already seen that he's been confronting some of the old values, right? The ones that were like legalistic and those kinds of things. And now he's saying, no, I have new values, and these are the ones I want you to have. So that's what we're going to be looking at, new kingdom values. Let's read together in Mark chapter 7, starting in verse 24. And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his finger into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." So these are two stories, but notice the shift. Where is Jesus shifting his focus? He's shifting his focus to the Gentile areas of Israel. So he has been, up until now in Mark, largely, almost entirely, focused on Galilee, specifically within Israel, the Galilean area. So he's been healing, he's been teaching, he's been doing all sorts of miracles, he's been going with his disciples, he's been sending them out to the children of Israel to preach to them the good news of the Messiah. And yet, through all of this, he has only made one trip to the Decapolis, which is another place that he goes in this story, to heal the demon-possessed man. You remember that story? We looked at that a few months ago. Okay? And he goes into Gentile territory, but then they don't want him. They're like, "Get out of here because you're destroying our livelihood because all of our pigs are now drowned in the water." Remember that? And he was like, "Okay, yeah, we don't want you here. I mean, you're changing demon-possessed people, but you're also, upsetting the apple cart in our economy. So get out of here." Okay? But he says something. Most of the time in Mark, he keeps telling people, "Don't say anything. Don't say anything. Don't say anything." And you can tell he does this again here, and they don't. They're like, "Okay," and then they go and tell everybody. And this is what happened with the demon-possessed man. He didn't say that. He said, because the demon-possessed man, or the ex-demon-possessed man, said, "I want to follow you. Can I be one of your disciples? One of your, now 13. And Jesus said, "No, because I have a mission for you, and that is I want you to go tell everybody in the Decapolis, in your Gentile region, people who are not Jews, I want you to tell them the great things that I've done for you." And so he says, okay, he turns around, and he starts telling people, and then we're going to see that he comes back to the Decapolis, and all of a sudden a lot of people know about Jesus. And now they want him, because they've seen this miracle happen. This person who's been transformed has been telling them this testimony. So we see this shift in Jesus' focus, and not only you can't really get this in the text very well, but Jesus goes, here's Israel, right? And this is the Galilean area, kind of surrounding the Sea of Galilee. He goes northwest to Tyre and Sidon, okay, which is a Gentile area, and then he doesn't go back through Galilee to get to the Decapolis, which would have actually been the more direct course. He goes around the northern part of Galilee. He comes to the Sea of Galilee in the Decapolis. Like he avoids the Galilean area at this point so that he can go through Gentile territory. So the first point, the first value that we see of Jesus is that his kingdom is constantly seeking new horizons. Jesus' kingdom is constantly seeking new horizons. Jesus, as we've just seen, seems to make an intentional move into Gentile territory and begins doing the same miracles that he was doing in Galilee. He's now doing them in the Gentile areas. Why is Jesus making these trips into Gentile territory? Well, there are a couple clues in the text that tell us a couple of things. And it actually shows us a little bit of Jesus' humanity along with his strategy. The first thing, I think, is he's trying to get away from opposition in Galilee. Like the Pharisees are coming at him. He has a lot of great things going on, but a lot of people who are questioning him and pressuring him. And what does our text say? That he was trying to get away, right? He says in verse 24, it says he entered a house and did not want anyone to know. So he's going to Tyre and Sidon because he's trying to take a break, get away from it all. But people heard that he was coming, and people came to him. So you kind of get this okay, I'm going to go to the Gentile territory. I have a purpose with this, but I need a bit of a break. I don't want anybody to know I'm here yet. He's trying to control this. And so he gets into a house, and then somebody heard, and somebody had already heard about Jesus and the miracles that he worked, and this woman comes and finds Jesus. Maybe he's visiting the Jews in these areas as well, because there were Jewish populations in these Gentile areas. But Mark places these stories, notice this, as a response to the confrontation that Jesus has with the Pharisees. What was that confrontation? About unclean things, right? And what were the Jews so concerned about? They're like, well, if you touch, if you're eating in the same basket as a sinner, a Jew that is not really following the law perfectly, then you're unclean. Much more if you eat in a basket that's been touched by a Gentile, you're unclean. Those Gentiles, that's like another level of uncleanliness, right? I mean, they're the worst. They're super unclean. So in a Jewish mind, if utensils and my hands being not washed ceremonially correctly can defile me, even more so the Gentiles. Remember what we talked about? That when a Jew walked through Gentile territory, when they got to the border of the Jewish territory, what did they have to do? They shake off the dust of their feet, saying right? I got out of Gentile territory. So Mark places these stories after that argument, and Jesus is like, oh, you think that these things are unclean? Well, I'm going to go to the people that you think are unclean. I'm making a statement here. There are new horizons for my kingdom that you're not seeing. Not only were the Pharisees thinking about avoiding unclean things, but you know what they thought that the Messiah was going to do? What did they think? They thought the Messiah was going to come in and he was going to expulse. He was going to kick out all of those unclean Gentiles out of Israel, and he was going to renew the cleanliness of Israel. He was like the real people of God, the real children of God. This inner circle, this was Jesus' horizon for his kingdom. That's what they thought the Messiah was. And Jesus is like, well, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. I'm not going to kick them out. And not only am I going to go to them, I'm going to give them the benefits of the kingdom. They get the same thing you do. They're a horizon for my kingdom. They're not closed corners of the world to my kingdom. And the Jews would have thought, well, Jesus isn't acting very Messiah-like, is he? And then we look at Genesis 12:3, and we remember the very first time God speaks to Abraham about the covenant. He says this, in you, Abraham, all of the families of the earth will be blessed. Not just this chosen nation. You are a chosen people. But through you, all of the families of the earth will be blessed. And then he repeats it in Genesis 22:18. He says again, in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. All of the nations, all of the ethnic groups, all of the city-states, all of them are horizons for my kingdom. And in Galatians 3:14, Paul, looking back on those covenant promises and then looking back on Jesus and his kingdom, he says this, so that in Christ Jesus, the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. So Paul sums it up. He says, God made promises to Abraham, but those promises were going to come through Jesus and to the Gentiles. That was the plan. And Jesus is just enacting the plan. Jesus is actually being very Messiah-like, according to the Bible. But who are the Gentiles? Well, in this story, the Gentiles are those in Jesus' day who were not Jewish, outside of the people of God, uncircumcised, which was a sign that we were a part of the covenant people, right, in the Old Testament. And Jesus goes purposefully to them. For us, who are our Gentiles? Because did you know probably all of us are Gentiles? Every single one of us. We are not, maybe there are some people who have Jewish descent, or are of Jewish descent, I should say, in here. It's possible. But the vast majority of us are Gentiles. We didn't come to God through the covenant of the Jews. We came through the new covenant of Jesus Christ. We are embraced by God because of Jesus, not because we are covenant people. Well, we are now. So who are our Gentiles? Where is the horizon in your life that you maybe have said, like the Jews, like, oh, those people, no way. And I don't want to fill that blank in for you, but I know we've got a few categories in our minds that we expect there's no way that those people should be offered the kingdom of God. There's no way they would become a part of the kingdom of God. But there are still horizons to take Jesus to. And where are they? The second value of the kingdom that he transmits to us today through this story is that the benefits of the kingdom, as we talked about, are for everyone who comes in faith. That's an important part of that statement. And oftentimes they are the ones that we least expect. The benefits of the kingdom are for everyone who comes in faith. And I would even say that the benefits of the kingdom through your life are really for everyone. The fruit of God that he produces in your life. So you can be kind to anyone. You don't have to be like, all right, are you a part of the kingdom of God? I'll be kind to you. That's not the vision of the Bible, right? Like all nations will be blessed. They'll be blessed in abundance by God's people. So we should be blessing and blessing and blessing and not be like checking their card. Like, can I bless you? Are you a part of the kingdom? Oh, okay, good. We're good. I can bless you now. Right? No, I'm just blessing. The abundance of God in my life should just pour out to anybody who's near me. And by that, then all of a sudden there's a new horizon for God's kingdom because they're experiencing the fruit. Notice that when, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but this is just too great, right? Like notice that the Syrophoenician woman, Jesus does not tell her. He doesn't tell her, you need to become a Jew. In fact, he doesn't even call her. All he does is he blesses her. He just blesses her. Now, obviously, she has come to him in faith. Can you imagine? She's a Jew, or she's a Gentile, and not only a Gentile, she's a Syrophoenician, which to us means nothing, except that she's from Syria, and she's a Phoenician of this people, right? That doesn't, but we don't even know what those categories are. Like, anybody ever met a Phoenician? Of course not. Right? But apparently they were seafaring people, but they were, this area of the world, they were known, and Josephus, who is a Jewish historian around the time of the Bible, he says that the people of Tyre were one of Israel's worst enemies. They were always, like, terrorizing Israel and the people of Israel. So she had a lot of things against her. in order to approach Jesus, this Jewish rabbi. And one of them is that she's a Gentile. The other is that she's Syrophoenician. The other, believe it or not, and this is just because this is the ancient world, a lot of things have changed, but she's a woman. And in the ancient world, a woman was not allowed to really approach a Jewish rabbi. And a Jewish rabbi would not normally take the time to speak to women. That would be under his, that's a lesser responsibility. Notice Jesus is always speaking with women, right? Always in the New Testament. That's just a side note, okay? And Jesus, he does speak with her. He does engage with her. But she has a lot to get over. Her faith is shown in that she knows that she's a Gentile. She knows that in the Jewish mind that she might be an enemy. She's a woman, so she doesn't have the right, so to speak, to come before Jesus. And then also she has a demon-possessed child. And a lot of people would have seen that, and we're going to talk about this in also the other story, they would have seen the fact that she had a demon-possessed child as possibly her fault. Your child is demon-possessed? You must have done something to deserve that. God's judgment has worked itself out in your life in the fact that your child is demon-possessed. And so all of that for a Jew would have been unclean, unclean, unworthy, unclean, unworthy. And yet she comes before Jesus and she throws herself before him in humility and in faith. And then we're going to see later she also persists in faith. And also we can see this in the deaf and the mute man story, right? And that oftentimes that they thought that the people would have physical disabilities because of the sin in their own life or the sin in their parents' lives. Remember, there were some Jews that came up to Jesus in another story, and they said, so this guy's blind. Is it because of his sin or his parents' sin? And Jesus said, neither. But in their mind, they thought that was a possibility. And the deaf and the mute man also would not have been seen as somebody with great value in their culture. Right? You couldn't converse, couldn't work probably in most of the things that they would do, maybe in some things. But most people couldn't connect with him. He would have been seen as something less valuable in their society. And yet Jesus engages with both of them in a very personal way. The first way is that Jesus tests the woman. He tests her by saying this. He says this statement, and to us it seems kind of crazy, right? He says, it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now she has just asked him for a miracle, and he's saying, basically, well, you probably shouldn't get anything because you're a dog, and the children should get it. They should get it first. At least that's what it looks like from the outside. And this goes along with Jesus' ministry principle of starting with the children of Israel. In Romans 1:16, Paul says it this way, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, the good news, for it is the power of God for the salvation to everyone who believes, but it's to the Jew first, and then also to the Greek. So there was an order here. Jesus came first for the children of Israel because he was in fulfillment to the promises that God had given the children of Israel. So he starts with the children of Israel, and yet then he goes out from there to the Greeks or to the Gentiles. Matthew 15:24 is Matthew's story of this same story with the woman. And this is, Jesus actually there says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So you're like, does Jesus really mean this? Or is he testing her? And I think he's testing her. Because he's saying a couple things. First of all, the Jews were God's chosen people. We've talked about that. Jesus came to fill God's promises to them first. And he also uses this term bread. What did bread mean in the Old Testament? Well, bread was God's blessing, his provision, and his covenant care of his people. You remember in the Exodus, the Old Testament manna? He sustained his people by providing them bread every single morning. Okay? So that there's a connection to the covenant. He's like, well, the children should get the bread, not the dogs. And he's just recently fed 5,000 men and their families. And what did he feed them? Bread and fish also. Amen to that. That would have been a lovely meal, sounds like. But he gives them bread, and he connects himself to the God of the covenant by providing bread. And here he tells her, well, you're not in the covenant, so I should give the children the bread, right? and it's not fit to give the dogs the bread that I would give to the children. And so he's calling her a dog. How many of you have ever been called a dog? And like, it's kind of cool in our culture, right? You're like, what up, dog? You're like, I'm doing great, dog, right? It doesn't come out of me very naturally, but that's a way of speaking, right? Like, but that's not obviously where we're going. And also dogs, the conception of dogs that we have is not the conception of dogs that the Jews had. Like, when you think of a dog, you think of your pet, your beloved little Fluffy, right? Like, that's what you think about. And our culture, we love our dogs. And I don't say that's a bad thing. I love dogs too, okay? Don't talk to my wife. She doesn't really like them, but I love them, okay? And so our conception of dog is that they're friends, that they're, we can cuddle up with them, we can have them in our house, we can have them, like, that's our conception of dogs. But the Jewish conception of dogs is different. And I want you to see a couple of pictures. Whoa, here they are. We used to look back there, now we're looking up here, okay? So this is actually a picture from Argentina. And when I was a missionary in Argentina for many years, and sometimes you'd be in some neighborhoods, usually on the outskirts of town, and you would come around a corner and you would see a pack of like 10 to 15 dogs. And it was terrifying because you're like, it's you and them and like nothing else, nobody else. And so you felt this danger. But generally speaking, they were pretty timid of people just because since they were puppies, they were street dogs, right? They'd been kicked around, they'd been mistreated, and so they had this natural fear of people. Yet, once in a while, and there are stories, and they do happen every other year or so, where they will find somebody who is weak, and they can kind of smell weakness in people, and these packs of dogs in some cities in Argentina have actually killed people. And so this is what happens when dogs are wild, right? When they're not domesticated, and they don't create this bond with humans, they become more naturally wild, and they're also starving, and so they're looking, right, and they kind of have this pack behavior, and they're dangerous. Dogs are dangerous. And the Jews would have had a similar conception about dogs. There were a lot of wild street dogs, okay? So when we think about dogs, even looking at these dogs, you're like, I would adopt one or two of these, right? But really, like, a Jewish conception of dogs is the concept that we have of the following picture. These are like what we would understand as Jewish dogs. They're dirty. Like, no, how many of you have a rat as a pet? Very few people. Some people. Okay, you do? Okay. I'm not dogging rats, all right? Like, that's cool. But we see them as nasty. They eat, garbage. They eat anything. They carry diseases. They're a nuisance. Nobody wants them around. Nobody wants to have them around. They're defiled, right? They're definitely defiled in our minds. So that would have been a common Jewish understanding of a dog. Now, Jesus, we're going to move on from there because Jesus actually uses a different word for dog. And I think what he's doing, this is how I think he's testing her. Because in the Greek, he does not use the word commonly understood as street dog. What he uses is, it's like, in Spanish, how many of you speak Spanish? Perro is dog, right? And perrito is what? Little dog, right? It's a way of making a word smaller. And that's the word he used. He used a diminutive, wow, I should have practiced that one, word to refer to the dog. Not like a street dog, but like a house dog, okay? So you can see this softening of the term. He's still using it. He's saying not the children, but the dog, but he's softening it, almost like a way of saying, like testing her, inviting her to continue, because he's not trying to overtly offend her. He also says, notice, he says that the children should be the first ones to get the bread, but he doesn't say the only ones. So he's also leaving open the idea that possibly a dog could get bread from the covenant, right? So the question is Jesus being racist or cruel? I think he's being sarcastic. And I think this sarcasm is an invitation to her to a response of faith. R.T. France, in his commentary of the Gospel of Mark, he puts it this way. He appears like the wise teacher who allows and indeed incites his pupil to mount a victorious argument against the foil of his own reluctance. He functions as what, in a different context, might be called a devil's advocate and is not disappointed to be defeated in argument. So basically he's saying, like, he's not even presenting the argument as his own. He's almost like presenting it as a Jewish mindset, right? He's almost saying like, sarcastically, let's read it together. When he says to her, he says, well, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. He's almost using like a common expression to see what she thinks. And her response is she persists in faith because she knows he's not like that. She knows that he's not like that. Something about him, what she's heard or what she senses in this conversation, the fact that he's engaging with her in the first place, tells her that she can trust him, even though his response is kind of surprising. She comes in humility and she persists. So that tells us that there's a value in the kingdom, that the benefits are for everyone who comes in faith, even people who were previously considered dogs. The kingdom is for them. It shouldn't be withheld from them. It should be offered freely to them. The next value in the kingdom that we see is just a little bit of Jesus is truly everything. Just a little bit of Jesus is everything. The woman's response shows that she understands who she understands Jesus to be. And she actually seems to understand better than a lot of the Jews. She gets it. She saw authority in Jesus. She said, could you please cast out the evil spirits that are tormenting my daughter, that nobody has the power or authority to do anything about, but you do. She recognizes his authority over evil spirits. And that's why she asks him. That's why she also falls down at his feet. Like, I'm desperate, and you have everything. You have the authority to change this situation, this part of my life, my daughter's life. But she also saw not only authority, but she also saw mercy in Jesus. She had probably heard about his healings and his miracles, and she brought her need before him, and she made a fool out of herself in order to do so. What would her other Syrophoenician friends have said, looking at her throwing herself at a Jewish rabbi's feet, asking, pleading, begging for a miracle? They would have been like, are you kidding me? You are going the wrong direction with this. We have our own gods. You should just go to them. I'm sure she had. And she's still in the same situation. But she recognizes mercy, that Jesus has this disposition to respond to her desperation. So she brings her need before him, makes a fool out of herself, trusting that he would respond in mercy because, and he did respond in mercy, and yet he did so in this really kind of weird way. Even after he calls her a dog, she persists, knowing that behind this sort of sarcasm that he is showing is mercy, is a heart full of mercy. Another thing she sees in Jesus is his power. She recognizes that even though she is not Jewish, that Jesus had enough power, and her statement shows that even a crumb left over from what the children ate would be enough to heal her daughter. Just a crumb. That's all I need. That's all I need. And Jesus is like that. You see it all the time, right? Where the woman is like, all I need is just to touch the hem of his garment. I don't even need to ask him for a miracle. He doesn't even have to have the intention. All I need to do is believe and just one little piece of Jesus. And that's everything for me. And so she understands that he has this immeasurable power within him. And that's why her response is, if I could just get a crumb, that's all I need. Because one little bit of you is everything. She's responding to Jesus, like we said, better than many Jews had responded to him. She understands more about who he really is than many of the quote-unquote children. A little bit of Jesus is everything, and that is a value of the kingdom. The last value is sometimes kingdom faith is pit bull faith. Since we're on the subject of dogs. Jesus calls her a dog, and she says, yeah, I'm a pit bull. And why do I say that? She latches on to Jesus and would not let him go until he blesses her. And that's what pit bulls do. That's why they're so scary. I mean, they're basically like, they have the physiology to be the best fighting dogs because their jaws are just enormous. Have you seen pit bulls? Even the nicest pit bulls out there scare me. And they probably shouldn't, but they do. Just their potential, right? If you wanted to, it would not take long. You could kill me. And I remember playing with this pit bull. It was a pet of a friend of mine, and it was a puppy. It was like a year old, right? And it was just this ball of muscle. And I remember it was playing with me, but it wasn't like playing with me like wagging its tail, like, having fun. Like, you get this idea, right? It was like I was the plaything, right? Like, I wasn't throwing a rope. I was it. I was the toy, And he would get down on his haunches, and he would just stare at me. And I kept looking over at his owner like, he's still playing, right? Like, we're still good. Like, yeah. And he would just launch himself and knock me over. And I couldn't do anything about it. Like, I tried to, push back a little bit, but he would just knock me plain over. And I knew that if he got his jaws on my neck, it was over. You could see it. And the thing about pit bulls, and I've heard stories, lots of stories, about when they lock down, you cannot do anything to get them to release it. Only when they want to can you really release it. Like, you can hit them, you can try to pry it open, but there's nothing you can do. They'll just latch on. And so how is that the same thing that she's doing? Well, no matter what he said to her, she would not relent until Jesus responded to her need, because she trusted. She knew that behind whatever this weird circumstance that he's putting forth, behind it is a person who has the authority and the power and the mercy and the love towards me to respond to my needs. And so I'm not letting go. Also, I have nowhere else to go. It's like when the disciples come to Jesus, right? And Jesus says this really hard saying, and everybody's like, that was weird, we're out, right? And then Jesus says to his disciples, hey, are you guys leaving too? And they say, Lord, that was weird, but they didn't say that. I'm paraphrasing. Where are we going to go? Because you have the words of life. Because there's something about you, and I don't know what it is, but we're not letting go. There's another story similar to this story of this woman, and that's when Jacob wrestles with God in Genesis 3:22 through 32. This is in the Old Testament. And Jacob meets a man as they're on the way. He is one of the patriarchs. In fact, out of Jacob come the 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? And actually, Jacob gets the name Israel in this story. Jacob meets a man as they're on the way, and the man begins to wrestle with him. The man touches Jacob's thigh, injuring him, yet Jacob continues to wrestle. He won't let go. And it actually says that the man tells Jacob to release him, and Jacob refuses to release the man unless he blesses him. He says, I'm not letting go until you bless me. Even though you've wounded me, even though you have the power to continue to wound me, I'm not letting go until you bless me. And the man asks his name, and Jacob tells him, my name is Jacob. And he says, no, your name is not Jacob anymore. It's Israel. And the word Israel, the name Israel, means he who strives or wrestles with God. And Jacob calls the place that this all happened, he calls it Peniel. And Peniel means the face of God, because he realized that in this wrestling match he had seen the face of God and had survived. That he was actually wrestling with God. And many think that this is an Old Testament appearance of Jesus. That he was wrestling with Jesus himself. And like the Syrophoenician woman, he's like, I know I can't let you go. You're too good. You have the authority. You have the power. I can't let you go. No matter what you say, no matter how bad it hurts sometimes. The things that you allow to happen in my life, sometimes they're confusing and they hurt. And yet I'm not letting you go. You can wound me, and I will not let you go. I'm holding on like a pit bull until you bless me. And you know why this is true? It's because children are allowed to wrestle with their father and come out blessed. You ever wrestle with your kids? Izzy and Kiki are on this, like, they want to wrestle all the time now. And so we're wrestling, and I usually let them win a little bit here and there. And Kiki the other day, she's like, Dad, are you letting us win? Are you letting us win? I'm like, yeah. She's like, no, you can't do that. You have to wrestle us, because otherwise, like, it doesn't mean anything to win, right? I'm like, okay, well, Kiki, if I wrestle you with, like, my full strength, I'll win every time. And she's like, oh, yeah, right? so we get into it, and of course, like, we wrestle 6 times, and it was 6 for 6, and Kiki's so determined. She's like, I'm like, have you had enough yet? And she's like, no, let's keep going, right? I'm like, no, we're not. I think we're done for wrestling for tonight. But the point is like, when I wrestle my girls, like, will I ever truly hurt them? Of course not. Not only that, and this is just an aside, and I think maybe it has something to do with it, but my girls are growing up a little too fast. I don't know if any of you guys feel that. And when I wrestle them, it's almost like another opportunity for me just to squeeze them a little tighter. There's like a closeness in the wrestling. And we're having fun, and they're testing their strength with me, and I'm showing them my power. And they know that this power that they experienced when they wrestled with me is for them. And they know that they can count on that power. That the dad that they can't beat in wrestling will use that power to defend them with his own life if it's needed. And that's exactly what happened with Jesus. Children have rights with their father. Children have a trust of their father's heart. That we wrestled and you didn't hurt me. And my girls don't know their strength, and they don't know sometimes like what's a legal blow and an illegal one, right? So I can tell you that, like, the hurt goes both ways, right? Like, I beat them, but sometimes, like, they don't know that you're not supposed to use your fists when you're wrestling, okay? But they have the trust of their father's heart. And sometimes that's the way we are. Like, sometimes in our wrestling with God, we're kicking and screaming, right? And we raise our fists up to heaven and we say, why? This hurts too much. This doesn't make sense from you. Why are you allowing this to hurt me? And we kick and scream against God. And then later on, after we finally relax in his arms, in his power, when we finally just give up, say, you win again, we realize that the entire time he was blessing us. He was loving us. He was showing us his mercy. Children have the right to grab onto their father and not let go until they get a blessing. They have that right. My girls can come up and, they'll sit on my lap and they'll ask me for something and I'll say no. And then they'll get those like glossy big eyes. Please, Dad. And I'll say no. And then they'll continue to persist. And they'll persist. And they'll persist until finally I say, okay. And this is what Jesus invited people to do in prayer. It's like, just keep coming to God. Because it keeps connecting you to the Father, number one. And also, there's a dynamic there. The more you persist with God, the more you pray, the more you focus on him, and the more you ask him like a child comes to his or her father, the more he blesses. You have not because you have asked not. And we have the right, as children, to come and grab on to our Father and not let go until he blesses us. The woman somehow knows that Jesus loves her like a child and not like a dog. She sees through his sarcasm. And that's why he responds to her faith. So she persists. Now, while our salvation does not depend on how strong our faith is, okay? Jesus said, the faith of a mustard seed. That's all it takes. You can't almost see it with your bare eyes, right? Like, it's so small. That's all you need. It's not about it's not about the strength of your faith. It's about the content of your faith. It's Jesus. So you just believe with whatever little faith you have, and he will save you, and then he, with his strength, will do and build your faith. So our salvation does not depend on how strong our faith is. But there are times, and if you've been walking with the Lord for any amount of time, you probably know this, where Jesus asks us to hold on for dear life and have faith like a pit bull. Have you ever been there? He's going to ask you sometimes to hold on for dear life, and you need to clamp down and say, I'm persisting. Jesus sometimes tests our faith like he did the Syrophoenician woman. Sometimes through that he is strengthening our faith. Maybe she got in there and she doubted a little bit, but then when it came to it, she's like, no, I'm not just a dog. I know even just a crumb is enough. She persists. It strengthens her faith, that testing of it. And then he allows the pain and desperation to deepen. And I don't know why he does, but I know he does. He allows things to go longer than I would have let them go. He allows her pain and desperation to deepen so that when his blessing comes, it is even that more miraculous, that more incredible. I'm going to ask the band to come up and we're going to close. And I'm just going to ask you a question. Do you share these values? These are kingdom values. These are Jesus' kingdom values. And he wants us to share them with him. He wants us to have them as our values. Are you constantly seeking new horizons for Jesus' kingdom to begin gaining ground? You know what a new horizon can be? It can be an old relationship that you have, one that you've had all your life, but that you've never engaged with, spiritually speaking. That's a new horizon. Or maybe one that you used to engage with, but you backed off a long time ago because you thought, well, they're the least likely person to come, right? Well, it's time to re-engage. That's a new horizon. That's Gentile territory, so to speak. Where are the new fields to plant the seeds of the gospel in faith that he can cause God's kingdom to grow and his blessing to be felt in those horizons in your life? Have you written off a certain people because you see them as devoid of value, too unclean, or even as enemies? Have you stopped praying for your enemy? You might be surprised. Maybe God has put them in your life precisely so that you might know the blessing, or so that they might know the blessings of Jesus and his kingdom through you. Maybe you have enemies so that you can show them God's incredible love. That's why they're your enemies. Who are your rats? I'm not going to say dogs because that doesn't work in our culture. Who are the ones that are just like, unclean to you? Like, you don't even want to get near them. You don't want to touch them. You hate seeing them. It's time to repent of that. It's time to make friends with rats. Time to open ourselves up and say, God, take me to these people that I thought were outside, too unclean. Are you ready to go to them with the bread of the kingdom that has been given to you by grace? Do you really believe that even just a crumb of Jesus is enough to transform the world? Are you convinced of his power, of his authority, of his mercy, and of his saving will? And lastly, do you have the value of pit bull faith? That come what may, it is worth to latch on to Jesus and never let go. Knowing that even if you are wounded in the process, that God's blessing is better than life itself in the end. These are the kingdom values that we are invited to incorporate into our own lives and our own heart.